على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So today, inshallah ta'ala, we are going to go through what is meant, two things, inshallah ta'ala. How the Quran has reached us. We've spoken in general about how the Quran has reached us. We want to speak in a bit more specifics about how the Quran has reached us. And we want to talk about the structure of Hadith books. So, Bismillah. Do we have any questions from last week? Does anybody have any questions from last week? Excuse me. Okay. So, remind ourselves of the definition of the Quran. Quran are the words that have reached us through mass narration, not limited individuals narrating the Quran, but rather multiple individuals, so many that it's impossible that there was a conspiracy or anything like that. Number 3, that it is a ritual to recite, and number 4, that it is miraculous in nature. We'll talk about these things one by one, and we have spoken about some of these things, but we're just going to now look at these concepts one more time. So when we said mass narrated, what does it mean? What we've expressed and explained many times is that whenever anything has reached us through a single source, whenever anything reaches through a single source, be it one book, one hadith narrator, one reciter of the Quran, there is always room for error. Doesn't matter how careful we are, there's always room for error. When something is mass narrated, when its sources are multiple, and it's not possible to put all those sources into one single source, then the possibility of error is no longer there. And so that's how the Quran has reached us. We want to demonstrate that, inshallah ta'ala, now. And before we do that, we have to understand that the Quran, obviously, just by the fact that it's recited day in and day out, it's obviously mass narrated. And so, the fact that it's being recited in the mosque, quoted by the fuqaha, quoted by somebody, we're going to list certain finite, limited names. But to imagine that these are the only people on the face of the earth that know about the Quran or know the Quran is ridiculous. Would be ridiculous. Rather, what we're going to list are those expert Quran reciters. We're going to be listing some of the expert Quran reciters. So, for example, take analogy of today. Take the analogy of today. You mention an expert Quran reciter. Oh, Khalil Husari. Sheikh Abdul Basit. Oh, you're saying there's only 2 people in the world that know the Quran? And they're both in Egypt? Oh my God, that means the Quran has been preserved in hiding in Egypt. So no, everybody knows about the Quran. What are you talking about? I'm just mentioning two scholars off the top of my head that are particularly, famous for reciting the Quran. That's all. And so we're going to be listing certain top-notch, super famous scholars just as by way of demonstration. But there are obviously countless other people. If you take any scholar in the world, how did the Quran reach him? Well, this scholar, that scholar, any Quran scholar has countless different chains of transmission for the Quran. So the Quran, by its very nature, by the fact that it was, number 1, small book, number 2, recited day in and day out, was widespread and known by everybody. All of the Sahaba knew a lot of the Quran. Many of the Sahaba had memorized the whole Quran. All of the Tabi'een knew some Quran. All of them had heard the Quran. All of the Tabi'een, the followers, many of them had memorized the Quran. And so it's something that's just ambient and well known. right? So what I'm going to be mentioning now is the key specialist narrators, just by way of explaining that, but that doesn't mean that nobody else knew the Quran, of course. Okay, is that point clear? Okay. So here we have certain imams, certain fantastic, well-known, recognized specialists of hadith of Quran recital. Right, here we have 7, and there's others we could add to this list as well. So we have Nafi', who was born in 80. Let's try and understand what that means. Born in 80. So 80 years after the Hijrah, approximately, he's born approximately 70 years after the Prophet had died, right? And he dies in 169. Ibn Kathir in 45, so he's born, 30, 40 years after the Prophet passed away, and he dies about 100 years, or 100 and so years after the Prophet dies. Abu Amr al-Basri in Basra, 68 to 154. Abdullah ibn Amr al-Shami, 8 to 118. Asim, so we don't know exactly when Asim was born, but he dies in 127, so maybe he's born approximately the same time, 30 years after the Prophet passed away. And here are the others as well. So you have people approximately they are born a generation or two after the Prophet passes away, and these people were particularly distinguished Quran reciters. Why were they? Well, let's look who they studied with. So if we look at Nafi', he was one of the greatest Quran reciters, and he studied with the students of Abdullah ibn Abbas. So he's studying with so he's not studying with the Prophet ﷺ, he's studying with the students of the Prophet ﷺ. And he's studying with many of these top-notch scholars, they're all scholars, and studying how to recite Quran accurately and properly. And similarly with the students of Abu Hurairah and the students of Ubay ibn Ka'b, right? So who made up the Quran then? Was it Abdullah ibn Abbas? No. Okay, was it Abu Hurairah? No. Was it Ubay ibn Ka'b? No. So it's not possible that any of those individuals, they themselves invented the Quran or invented surahs of the Quran or verses of the Quran, because here we have somebody who's studying with, again, multiple sources for the Quran, right? And they're not different Qurans, they're one thing, right? And so he's studying the nuances and subtleties of how to pronounce the Quran with these people, and it's all the same Quran, and it's obviously reaching them, etc. Now Nafi' has many students, and Nafi' his qira'ah is very famous, and is generally the nuances of his recital. We will notice, for example, when we go to North Africa, and you go to, for example, Morocco, you go to Libya, etc., you will find often people reciting. So he was originally in Medina, but this spread to the east and into Muslim Spain, etc. And his what we call his qira'ah, his style of reciting the Quran, based on these many students, teachers that he had with, he studied with, is somewhat famous in those areas. So again, today when I go to Morocco, pick up Mus'haf, what am I reading? This is a Mus'haf, and the subtleties of how to pronounce it are based on what the student Warsh and Nafi', who studied with Nafi', who studied with the students of the Sahaba. Right? That's where it comes from. Okay, so was Nafi' the only person on the face of the earth who knew the Quran? No. Okay, well, who knew it then? Well, all his teachers, obviously. Okay, well, who else knew it? Was it a secret thing in Medina? No, it wasn't. We also have one of the greatest qurra, greatest reciters in Mecca. So if we look at Ibn Kathir, we mentioned he was 45 to 128 to 120. So who is he studying with? He's studying with the students of Abdullah ibn Abbas in Mecca. So if there was a conspiracy in Medina, this conspiracy would be broken, or we could compare it against Mecca and say, well, there's another place over there with different people, different times, different teachers, etc. And so there's no conspiracy. This is the concept of mass transmission, is something that is there. And again, is he the only person in Mecca who knows the Quran? No, he's the most famous teacher of the nuances of reciting the Quran in Mecca, and he studied with the students of Ibn Abbas, Ibn Kathir. How does his Warsh? So there's Warsh an Nafi', okay, Warsh an Nafi', and then there is Qalun an Nafi'. So the differences are going to be in things like subtleties of, for example, how acute the sound is. We'll discuss this later on when we go into the qira'at in detail. But things like, for example, do you say Musa or Musa or Musi? So this is the kind of accuracy we're talking about. So is it Musa or Musi or Musi, right? And so often you will have the Nafi' in reality, because he studied with many people, he wasn't always reciting the same way. So you might have certain variables that he adopted, and some of his students adopt some, and some of his students adopt others. So generally you find with Qalun, there are less mudud, right? The mads are like, for example, in Warsh and Nafi' we have lots of mudud. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was the verse? Alam antum a'lamu amillah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, antum, are you, a'lam, more knowing, amillah, or is it Allah, or does Allah know more? So how do we recite it? We recite it Hafs and Asim, antum a'lamu amillah. That's how we recite it. In Warsh, it's got lots of mudud. Antum a'lamu amillah. So notice how long that was, right? So even if I recite it slowly, in Hafs and Asim, it doesn't have all those mudud. إن الذين كفروا سواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم. Right? Notice there's lots of mudud in there. Right? In Qalun, generally you find less. You find less than Warsh. Okay. So we have Ibn Kathir studying with the students of Ibn Abbas in Mecca. So then we go to Kufa. In Kufa we find lots of ulama, because lots of people in Kufa. Kufa was a garrison city. It was built by the Muslims as a garrison city. Lots of people there, hustle and bustle, the big city. Lots of scholars there. So we have Asim. So we usually in the mosques in most of the Muslim world, we recite Hafs and Asim. We recite the Quran, the nuances of the Quran as recorded by Hafs from Asim from so and so. Who did Asim study with? Asim studied with the students of Ibn Abbas, and he studied with the students of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and he studied with the students of Ubay ibn Ka'b. All of these people are students of the Prophet Sahaba. Sayyidina Uthman, the students of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and the students of Zayd ibn Thabit. So again, if there's a conspiracy happening between Mecca and Medina, that there's one Quran there and another Quran over here, that's just impossible. That's just impossible. Why? Because of all these different people corresponding on the same thing, right? And again, when we say he's studying the Quran, studying the nuances, right? Studying the nuances of the Quran, right? And so we're not even talking about differences anyway. Everyone is reciting the same Quran. There is no distinction. There's no different Quran. So this again gives us a picture of what we were talking about last week of so-and-so, that it's mass narration. So here we have not just one person narrating the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ, or two, or three, or four, but many and many and many. Right? It's mass narrated. Also we have Hamza al-Zayyat, also a Kufan scholar. He studies with the students of Ali, and the students of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and the students of Zayd ibn Thabit as well, and the students of Abdullah ibn Abbas. Okay, so again, it's not just one source. There's multiple sources for the Quran. Right? And it's not just Hamza Zayyat. He's one of the greatest Qurra, and there's many other Qurra around him, but this is one of the greatest. Right? And we have Abu Amr al-Basri, there's an S missing here, Basri, from Basra in Iraq, and he studied with the students of Ibn Abbas as well. And then we have the teachers of Abdullah ibn Amr al-Shami in Damascus. He studied with the students of Uthman ibn Affan, Sahabi as well. So again, these are some of the key Qurra. The last one here is Al-Kisa'i, who in reality is a student of Hamza al-Zayyat, we already mentioned. And he studied with the grand students of Ali ibn Abi Talib and the grand students of Sayyidina Uthman, radiallahu anhum ajma'in. So again, you can see that these key, most famous hadith, Quran reciters are all narrating, are all learning the nuances of Quran from many people who have many different sources. It's not some kind of elite in Damascus. You know, the Quran was written in Damascus and codified in Damascus, and these are kind of like some kind of elite or all locked up in some place. Like, no, it's all over the place. It's all over the place, right? And there's many other people around them. So to come along and say, well, the Quran, you know, I'm not really sure. It's like, how are you not really sure? Like, how is it possible that there's any error? How? Because it's not going through one source, it's coming through so many sources and it's all the same. Where is the room for error? Where is the need to question whether or not the Quran is authentic? You can question whether or not the Quran is true. That's something else, there's another discussion. What Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what he recited, was that true or not? That's another question. But whether or not he recited these words is not a question. We are not going to ask the question, is this actually part of the Quran or not? Because it's not possible that all these different people with different sources all manage to come up with the same thing and create, for example, something in the Quran that never existed. If we compare this to that Bible, all we have is some works that are supposed to go back to 100 or 200 years after Jesus, but we don't have any sources. So you might argue, well, look at this person's living, you know, like over 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, but it's not the same, because he's narrating from multiple sources, and we know these sources, and also what he's saying conforms to what everyone else is saying. So when you compare the Quran to the Gospel of Matthew, it's just not the same. Here we have something that seems to date to a certain time, but then where's the gap? We don't even know where it's coming from. Here we're talking about something that's all the same. These independent sources are all saying the same thing. So therefore that original thing must have been there. It's not possible for these independent people to all conspire under some kind of you know, religious movement to create something called the Quran. That's not possible. It's just not possible. Okay, does that make sense? Atif, is it making sense? Atif, you there? Great. It makes sense? Will you be touching on the ahruf? We will. So this was just in terms of, we were mentioning this in terms of narration, in terms of the differences, and where do those differences come from? What is the difference between the ahruf and the qira'at? We will be talking about those, inshallah. Okay. This is what we're trying to demonstrate is, with the details, what does tawatur mean? What does tawatur mean? What does mass transmission mean? In a bit more detail than without just in the general sense of mentioning about last week. Okay, so let's go now on to our hadith. And so we talk about, we mentioned last week about hadith books being written. This week we want to talk about early hadith works and late hadith works. So if we look at early hadith works, we're talking about in the second and third centuries, first and second centuries, you can say, actually, first and second centuries, and beginning of the third century. We will find that the hadith books are mixed. What does that mean? I mean, you pick up this book and it has hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ with a chain transmission back to the Prophet ﷺ, and a chain transmission back to Sahaba saying the Sahabi said this and the Sahaba said that, and a chain transmission going back to the followers. For example, Kitab al-Athar by Imam Abu Yusuf, Qadi Abu Yusuf, the great Chief Justice of the Abbasid Empire. He has this book called Kitab al-Athar, a book of footprints. Okay, footprints of who? Of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and Tabi'een, of the early Muslims. It's a very normal thing to see. Very, very normal. Right? You look at the Muwatta of Imam Malik, one of the most famous and authentic works of hadith ever, and one of the most useful. The Muwatta of Imam Malik, the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, for example, again of the Hanafis. Hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, hadith of Sahaba, and fatwa and positions of the Tabi'een. It's very common. In fact, some chapters will not have a single hadith in it. Just the chapter says, the Sahabi so-and-so said this, Tabi'i said this. Right? For example. The Musannaf of of Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani. Very large work. Very, very large work. It printed at least one of the most useful prints of it is in 11 volumes. So the Muwatta is just one volume, right? But the Musannaf 11 volumes. Large work to do with, and so it mentions chapter on marriage, chapter on type of some issue in court, chapter on what breaks your wudu, and it quotes hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and fatwa of the Sahaba, positions of the Sahaba and of the Tabi'een. Right? Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba, same kind of thing. So this is Ibn Abi Shayba, one of the teachers of the authors of the 6 books in hadith, right? And so he has the same thing. The Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba, edited in about 24 volumes, a large book. Again, pick up any chapter. Can you get married without your father's permission? Chapter. Pick up the chapter. What does hadiths on it? Hadiths on it for, against, fatwa for and against, position of the Sahaba for and against. Very common. The Sunan of Sa'id ibn Mansur, which in reality I believe is, it's not exactly, it's called a Sunan, but in reality, at least what we have of it, we have about 8 volumes left of it, is just on tafsir. So again, so tafsir is going to have hadith from the Prophet on this verse, something that one of the Sahaba said about this verse, and the Tabi'een as well. Right? It's mixed. Right? This is what we generally find in early hadith works. Now the question is, why, if it's mixed like that, why? Why would you do that? Right. So why do you think? Why do you think we'd do that, Atif? Why do you think it's useful to have a book that says Hadith, Sahaba, and Tabi'in? Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, words of the Prophet ﷺ, words of the Sahaba, and words of the Tabi'in. Why would you do that? Why do you think it's useful to me and you? Okay, good. So what is, are all hadiths very clear? Some hadiths, could some hadiths be understood in more than one way? Exactly. So sometimes there's a hadith or a verse of the Quran, I would quite like to know how they understood the hadith or how they understood the Quran. It's quite useful. Right? Also, sometimes there's the hadith doesn't talk about it. Right? It doesn't talk about it. Exactly, right? And so sometimes there might be a topic that I would like to know about. For example, the Prophet ﷺ said you can't pray after sunrise. Okay? But at the same time, the Prophet ﷺ saw a Sahabi praying and asked him, what on earth are you doing? Why are you praying after Fajr? And so he asked the Sahabi, what are you doing? and the Sahabi said, no, I missed the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, so I'm praying them now. Rasul didn't say anything. So what does that mean? Does it make it sunnah to pray the 2 rak'ahs that you missed before Fajr, after Fajr? Does it make it permissible? Like, what is it? So it's quite useful for me as a trying to researcher, trying to find out how should I apply this hadith, to find out, for example, that, let's say, one of the Sahaba or one of the Tabi'een would make up his 2 rak'ahs, but he would do it after sunrise. So someone would come up, then he'd do them. Interesting, right? Helps me understand it, right? It helps me understand, for example, that the hadith that say, for example, use siwak, or how often. And it's useful for me to understand that one of the Sahaba used to put his siwak on his ear like this. So he said they used to put it there like a carpenter's pen. And every now and then he's doing siwak. Right? It gives me an idea and helps me understand. Fills in the gaps. Makes things a bit clearer. Right? So it's very, very useful. Sometimes there's no information, and what the Sahaba did helps us understand. Sometimes there is information, but it could be understood this way or that way, and it helps us understand it. So it's extremely useful. Right? Fatwa, Sahaba, and Tabi'een are extremely useful. Okay, great. Now, if we look at later hadith works, they're usually either based on topic or based on narrator. Okay, based on topic or based on narrator. And so, for example, if it's based on topic, it could be, for example, an essay, what we call a juz'. Right? Somebody's writing a hadith collection on a very specific topic. That's it. Or it could be a comprehensive thing. For example, we will see examples. It could be quite comprehensive, a whole hadith book. Or it could be just to do with halal and haram. So, for example, Imam al-Bukhari has a work called On Allah's Creating the Action of His Slaves. That's the book. Khalqullah Af'al al-Ibad. That's the book. It's only about the very specific theological topic that our actions, if they are ours, are they created by Allah or not? And he's saying, yes, they are. So that's what the book is on. Right? That's topic based. Okay? And in it, because it's topic based, there might be Sahih hadiths, there might be Hasan hadiths, and there might be weak hadiths as well. It could be comprehensive. Right? Comprehensive means it talks about halal and haram. It also talks about tafsir and talks about, for example, heaven and hell and these kind of things. A general good overview. So if you were to sit down and read the whole of Tirmidhi, you'd have quite a good idea of what the Prophet spoke about. You wouldn't have read everything the Prophet spoke about, that's for sure. But you'd have a good idea because it's comprehensive. The Jami' of Tirmidhi, the Jami' al-Sahih al-Mukhtasar of Bukhari. So Sahih Bukhari is a Jami' Mukhtasar. So it talks about, it's brief, but it talks about, for example, revelation, talks about the prophets, talks about all sorts of things. Right? It's comprehensive. And then we have just halal haram, which we call the sunan. So when we say Sunan Ibn Majah, Sunan Abi Dawood, Sunan An-Nasa'i, the Sunan Ad-Darimi, for example, these are like the Sunan of Abi Dawood. These are to do with halal and haram. So these don't have things to do in them generally about prophets and this prophet happened and this happened, tafsir. Generally, we don't really find like du'as and things like that because it's to do with halal and haram, more like hardcore. What's halal, what's haram. Okay. Now, it's extremely important to understand, and we're just going through things very, very briefly. It's extremely important to understand that when I'm talking about halal and haram, if that's my topic, for example, if you open up Abu Dawood, you will find Sahih hadiths in it, and you'll also find weak hadiths in it. Why do you think, Atif, there would be what's the point in reading about a weak hadith to do with halal haram? So I'm trying to work out something. Is this halal or is this haram? What's the point in reading a weak hadith? If it's weak, well, what's the point in it? Why even put it there? And anybody else who's joined is perfectly welcome to give a suggestion as well. So why on earth, if I'm trying to work out whether something's halal, haram, why on earth would I read a weak hadith? I don't even know if the Prophet said it or not. Weak means he could have said it, he might have not said it, I don't know. Why would I want to know about, okay, depends on your strategy. If it's a weak but has many chains leading to it, then some might consider the weakness to be removed. Okay, let's assume that's not the case. Right, I'll give you an example, Altif. I'm reading the verse of the Quran. And it says, "Awla mastamun nisa," or if you touch women. And it's talking about tayammum, it's talking about wudu, it's talking about going to the bathroom, it's talking about making ghusl. And I'm trying to work out, like, la mastamun nisa, touching me. Does that mean intercourse? Or does that mean touching? Is it useless to come across a weak hadith that backs up the idea that it means intercourse and not merely touching? Is it useless? So I'm trying to weigh up this the verse. Is it talking about this, or is it talking about that? It's not really clear. And one weak hadith pushes the argument one way. Is that useful? I think it's useful. Right? Imagine if I'm going to buy a house, and my friend says don't buy it, the other one says do, and then my grandma, she has an opinion. It's like, well, grandma, with all due respect, I mean, do you know much about houses in this area? I mean, I don't know. And she has just an insight, for example, into buying houses in Spain. It's not useless. It's not useless. Sometimes a little piece of information, when you're trying to weigh something up, tips the balance. So particularly when I have hadith, certain hadiths and certain positions of the Sahaba that help me weigh it up. And then I add to that the multi-layered discussion, a weak hadith, another weak hadith that goes against it, another weak hadith a little bit stronger, right? It's useful. I'll give you an example. The Prophet ﷺ forbade vague contracts. That's very clear. It's a hadith, Sahih hadith. The Prophet ﷺ forbade vague contracts. Okay? And I'm trying to work out, does that vagueness apply to this scenario or not? Right? So for example, I come along and I say, okay, an unrefundable deposit, is that vague or not? So listen, I'm going to give you, for example, $2,000 towards this car. I want you to save that car for me. The car's for $20,000. As an unrefundable deposit. Right? Meaning, if I don't end up taking the car, you get to keep the money. Is that considered vague in that I don't know whether or not I'm going to give you the money and you don't know whether or not you're going to buy the car? Or is that considered kind of excused? Like, I know the hadith says the Prophet ﷺ forbade vague contracts, but I'm not sure if this is considered vague or not. Right? So then along comes a weak hadith and says the Prophet ﷺ forbade unrefundable deposits. There we go. Thank you very much. That's what I was looking for. I was kind of thinking that's what it meant, but I wasn't really sure. And then a weak hadith comes along and says the Prophet ﷺ forbade weak unrefundable deposits. Right? It's useful. It's not a final word, but it's useful. And then it's also useful, as we mentioned before, that we find that Sayyidina Umar allowed unrefundable deposits. Aha. So you can see how multi-layered this discussion is. I have a general principle that's quite clear there in the Sharia, and I understand that that's clear and authentic. I'm trying to find out if it applies to this particular scenario, and the weak hadith might help me, right? And And also the fatwa of Sahabi might also help me. So you can see how all of these things help the discussion. It's not useless, right? It's not useless. So why would Abu Dawood or Nasa'i or any of these people quote a hadith even though it's weak? Well, because we use them. We use weak hadiths. They're useful. They help us get through a picture, right? It's very useful, right? And so it could be in conjunction with other evidence, in conjunction with a kind of understanding I'm already getting from the verse of the Quran or already getting from a hadith, and it's very useful. Okay. And so even if it's weak, it's useful. It's not a waste of time, and it helps you understand the picture. So why would we in something that Abu Dawud, why would you get sound and weak hadiths? Because weak hadiths help us understand things. And in reality, Abu Dawud has a very important. Abu Dawud, he introduced his book to the scholars of Mecca, and he described his book and and he said any hadith that I don't criticize is salih, it's good enough, meaning it's sound or borderline sound or not too weak and good enough to use in halal and haram. It's quite a profound statement, right? It's quite a profound statement. He's saying that basically, if it's salih, it's not super weak and it's not really weak. It's somewhere in between weak and authentic, and so you can use it, i.e., with other evidence. It's a useful discussion. So you have to understand that the jurist does not pick up the Quran and say, "Is it halal, haram?" Oh, it's halal. Let's move on. He's looking at the whole of the Quran and all of the hadith, and he's putting together a whole system, a whole matrix, and every little part of that matrix is relevant, even if it's weak. Even if it's weak, it doesn't matter. It's relevant. It's part of the discussion. Helps shape that whole matrix. Okay. So here's another question for you. Given that we've just answered how important it is to look into the fatawa of Sahaba and Tabi'een, and how, yes, it's not absolute because they're not prophets at the end of the day, but it is useful. And given that it's useful when we're discussing halal haram to look at weak hadiths, why do you think you might buy a copy of the Muwatta of Imam Malik printed along with the Sunan of Abi Dawood? Why do you think that's the case? Where would the elegance, the convenience be in having those two books right in front of you here on the same page, same topic? Good. So a more complete picture. Good. What will I see in the Muwatta of Imam Malik? What three things will I see? So let's say I go under the topic of stoning someone to death for adultery. Here's the topic. What three things will I see under that topic? Or three type of things will I see under that topic in the Muwatta of Imam Malik? So you've already answered it correctly, Atif, but I want you to spell it out for everybody else. Inshallah as well, I'll answer your very good observation as well before. Hadith, custom of people of Medina, sayings of Sahaba. So you're going to find four things, very good. Right? You put four things, which is good actually, because there's another thing you mentioned that there's more detail. So the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith or the words of the Sahaba, and of the Tabi'in. And the fourth thing as well, what is the agreed upon practice of Medina? That's something else. That's a separate point. We don't talk about that. So anyway, a book like the Muwatta, I open it up and like, oh, what did the Prophet ﷺ say about this? What did the Sahaba say about this? What did the Tabi'in say about this? Great, fantastic. Okay. Now, alongside it is printed Abu Dawood, which will give me sound and weak hadiths on that same topic, for and against a certain discussion, right? So I get that very nice, rounded discussion there. It's not everything. I still need to do more research, that's true, but it's a good place to start, right? I get a quite complete picture. Are there any weak hadiths that go against this topic? Are there any sound hadiths that go against this topic? Are there any, etc.? You know, it gives you the whole flavor. It's useful. If you just say only hadith by itself, you might not get the full picture. I only want Sahih hadith. Okay, well, you won't really get the whole picture. Because in reality, the jurist, when they're working, they don't just work with Sahih hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ. They work with that, along with quotes from the Sahaba, Tabi'een, weak hadiths, principle X, principle Y. They get a whole picture before they give an answer. Right? You get a whole picture. Right? Like a detective, it's a whole picture. Right? Is that clear, Atif? So the thing about Medina, that's something extra. Okay. Then Atif asked a very good question. He said, shouldn't this, what was it? Shouldn't this, in the context of the topic and gravity of the situation, shouldn't this vary based on the context of the topic and the gravity? Yes, it is. In reality, weak hadiths are only really useful when there's a context. So weak hadith just by itself is fairly useless. So there's a weak hadith that the Martians are going to land in 2022. This is useless because it's just obviously wrong. Why, when is it useful? Is when there's already an inclination, there's already something there giving that suggestion from the hadith, and this is filling in the gaps. It's useful. Number one. Number two, for example, when you're talking about like a dua, you know, for example, a dua, like here's a nice dua to leave when you go leave your house, right? So if you ask my son Abdul Razak, and he's not Abdul Razak Sanani, but Abdul Razak Dingle, what's the hadith? Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min an adhil aw udhal, an azil an uzal, an adhlima an udhlima, aw ajhala am yujhala alay. Right? When you leave the house, you say, oh Allah, I seek protection from you, lest, what is it? I behave ignorantly, or I'm shown ignorance, or yes, lest I slip up, or I'm slipped up, lest I become lowly, or I'm made lowly, unless I'm wronged or made wronged, etc. I can't remember the order of the translation, but effectively that meaning. Now this hadith is weak. Why? Because there's a gap in the chain, right? So I used to teach the boys when I used to take them to school. You know, he's 4. What's the hadith? Mansur and Sha'bi and Salama. Right, so the hadith goes from Mansur and Sha'bi. Sha'bi, one of the great tabi'een. But this great tabi'i, he didn't necessarily meet Salama. The question is, did he or did he not meet Salama? So there's a gap then in the chain, because who is Sha'bi narrating the hadith from? If he didn't meet Salama, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, who's quoting the Prophet ﷺ, then there's a gap in the chain. So anyway, is that a problem if I recite a dua like that? No, it's fine. I'm not trying to make something halal or haram on a weak hadith. So a weak hadith and those kind of things, not a big deal. In general, when we talk about general akhlaq of Islam, weak hadiths are quoted left, right, and center. It's not a problem, because we're not trying to establish halal, haram. Right? So if we look, for example, Imam Bukhari in Sahih Bukhari, which is a collection of hadith on super Sahih hadiths, versus Imam Bukhari on Adab al-Mufrad, how the individual should be. He's not trying to prove halal and haram there. And so the hadiths are, I don't know if there's any particularly clearly weak hadiths in that collection, but it wouldn't be surprising if there were. But certainly, there are hadiths in that book of a certain level that are nowhere going to be found in Bukhari. So yes, the topic is also relevant, right? Okay, great. So then there are, of the late works as well, there's also hadith works based on narrator. So for example, the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, the Musnad of Al-Bazzar, the Musnad of Al-Humaydi, the Musnad of Abi Ya'la, right? So these masanid, how are they based? they are not based on topic at all. If you pick it up like, okay, I want to read hadiths about mourning, I want to read hadiths about marriage, I want to read hadiths about Eid, nothing. There's nothing to do with it whatsoever. It's to do with hadith narrator. So Musnad Ahmad begins with hadith narrated from Abu Bakr, hadith narrated from Umar, hadith narrated from Uthman, hadith narrated from Sayyidina Ali, etc. Right? Hadith narrated from Abu Hurairah. Complete different. That's how the hadith is organized. Right? It's not organized based on topic, but by narrator. Right? This is very useful because if I can see one hadith up here and see how it's narrated this way, this way, this way, I put it all together in terms of the narrator and who else is narrating the same hadith from that same person, I can see inconsistencies. So when you're dealing with hadith criticism, Musnad is way more useful. Much more useful. When I'm dealing with fiqh, a sunnah is way more useful. So the 4 sunan, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Nasa'i, and Abu Dawood are for fuqaha. It's for the fuqaha to look at. But the Masani, this is for the muhaddithin to look at. Right? So everyone's going to use everything in reality. But the Musnad is organized for the muhaddith to critique what's going on. Where's the problem in the chain? Whereas the other ones are organized for the faqih to look at what's the proof on this topic. And then we have al-Mu'jam as well. This is not based on the same order, but it's by Tabarani, for example, but it's based on alphabetical order of the Sahaba. Right? Okay, we mentioned those. Now, how many books are there? Like, how many books are there? In reality, they're innumerable. Basically, every single time you pick up a hadith book, you're going to find the hadith book referencing another hadith book that you've never heard of in your life. Right? There are key hadith books, the 6 books, the Sahih Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hibban. There's like 10 kind of famous ones, but otherwise, it's like an unlimited source of hadiths, unlimited almost. Like to say, if somebody said, "I have every single hadith book," I wouldn't believe them. I wouldn't believe them. And many, lost in somewhere in library somewhere that have not printed, right? And why is that the case? Because hadiths are also found organically in all early works of Islamic scholarship. So you live in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, in the 4th century, in the 5th century. You just quote a hadith, and that hadith you heard from so-and-so. So you quote his source, and you quote his source for it, and there we go. And so you're going to be reading a book on grammar, and he mentions a hadith, right? It was in Ramadan, I believe. You were reading Al-Kisa'i, whom we mentioned, the Qari of the Quran. So he's a grammarian, right? He's a Kufan, I believe. Kufan? Yeah, Kufan grammarian. The Kufan school of grammar. So he's discussing a fine point in the Quran and he quotes a hadith like that. There we go. Books of history. History, just like hadith, talk about their sources. So they're often going to quote their sources and quote a hadith. Right? So whose is it? Tarikh Dimashq. Is it Ibn Asakir, I believe? Ibn Asakir. The history of Damascus. So, well, what's that to do with hadith? Well, he's going to, in Damascus, were there not Sahaba? Of course. Well, didn't they quote hadiths? Of course. So he's going to quote, with his chain transmission, back to a Sahaba, he's going to quote a hadith. Tafsir, right? How many hadiths, for example, in Tafsir al-Tabari? Countless hadiths. And so to say that you've read every single hadith, that's impossible. That's impossible. To say that you have every single hadith book, that's impossible, right? No one's got that. And so that's why when you're doing hadith research, you have to dig a lot. You have to dig a lot and look into to be extremely well read, right? And often we find many hadith scholars also historians, like Imam al-Dhahabi. He's a historian, he's also a hadith scholar, right? Imam al-Sakhawi, al-Tabari, right? Bashar Awad. So Dr. Bashar Awad, one of the great hadith scholars of today in Jordan, he's originally Iraqi. So his PhD was what? In history. And he works in hadith. Right? There's a great tie between the two of them. But generally speaking, you're going to find all over the place. Imam Shafi talking about halal haram in the and he quotes a hadith. There we go. There's a hadith with a chain transmission. There we go. And so hadiths, are innumerable. To find every single hadith, nobody knows every single hadith, and nobody has every single hadith book, and nobody's listed every single hadith. But, most of them. You could say most hadiths, let's say, a total, how many hadiths do we have in total? Probably about 40,000, something like that. Okay, so we've spoken today about how the Quran has reached us. We went through some of the details about these top-notch scholars and who they study with. And so if we were to go the circles around them and other people, we're going to find again, it's impossible that the Quran has reached us in some kind of conspiracy. With a hadith, you could make that claim. So with a hadith, it goes to one person, from one person, from one person, right? You can say, well, I don't believe that hadith is possible. So finally, you're probably unreasonable to make that claim, but it's not logically impossible. It's not logically impossible. But with the Quran is a fabrication that somehow existed in the 3rd or 2nd century, 200 years after, you know, the Arabs bursted out of Saudi Arabia, they kind of invented the Quran somehow in retrospect. That's absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. There's impossibility, right? Because the sources are too many. The sources are too many. With hadiths, most hadiths, that is in principle possible, but extremely unlikely and unreasonable to assume. But again, it's conceivable because you only have one person, as we demonstrated last week, one person quoting from one person. So remember a lot of the hadith last week, we found all the sources and they all merged at Qatada from Anas from the Prophet. So maybe Qatada made up the hadith. It's conceivable. Maybe Anas made up the hadith. Fine, it's theoretically conceivable. It's extremely unlikely and unreasonable to judge that. It's unreasonable, and you're wrong to judge that, but it's conceivable. But when you have Qatada and so on else and so on else and so on else, everybody, all these different people quoting the Quran, it's just not possible that anybody invented the Quran single-handedly, or they made it a conspiracy made up. So that's what we mean by tawatur, mass narration, as opposed to a hadith, which is ahad, by individuals. Okay, any questions or queries? Okay, we'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان الله وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاك الله خير. Inshallah, Atif, we'll see you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.